As recorded in the Book of the Kings, in the days when Ahab reigned over Israel and Jezebel ruled beside him, there rose a man from Tishbe in Gilead, a prophet whom the Lord sent with word and with fire. He came into a land torn between altar and idol, between drought and the promise of rain, and his voice moved like thunder across plains of wheat and courts of palace halls. Before the tale unfolds, a brief word. If this story stirs you, stay until the end, subscribe to follow these retellings, ring the bell to be notified of what comes next, and leave a like so that others may find this account of faith and trial. Elijah was a figure of stern outline, a man clothed in a mantle of rough hair, a stranger marked by conviction more than by courtly grace. He stood before Ahab with the authority of one who had found his commission in the hearing of God. The king, who had led the people toward foreign altars and accepted the counsel of Jezebel, listened. The crowd that gathered at the gate of Jezreel watched with the measured fear of men who had seen words made reality. "Elijah the Tishbite," he said, and his voice did not waver. "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." The proclamation fell like a stone into a still pool. Whispers ran through the courtyard, prophecy, curse, blessing, and the fields beyond the city, green no longer, took on the color of dust. The king's household moved with an uneasy haste. Jezebel, far from the restraint of a council of elders, would not let a prophet's word stand unchallenged, and thus the land began to feel the first thin crack of a drought that would test kings and poor alike. The Lord had given Elijah his way of provision. The prophet was ordered to withdraw from the centers of power, to go eastward and hide by the brook Chariot that flows toward the Jordan. There, in the narrow wash of stones and wild thyme, the Lord provided as he had done in the days of fathers and patriarchs. Ravens came at the dawn and the dusk, unclean birds by the law, yet instruments of God's mercy. They brought bread and meat beside the water, their dark wings making brief shade across the dry face of the prophet. The brook itself murmured a small music, a ribbon of memory of past rains, while farther off the land lay open and pale. The air tasted of dust and iron, lizards darted among the pebbles. The rough sound of Elijah's mantle on his thigh was a constant companion. In the nights he listened for the footfall of danger and the whisper of the Lord. He prayed in short breaths, sometimes aloud, sometimes like a man speaking to himself in the dark. "Lord," he would say, "sustain me in this place. Let the bread be enough, let the stream not fail." Seasons folded over each other, the brook lowered, stones showed with rings of salt, and the ravens still came. Men who later told the story would marvel that God used such means, birds and a running brook, to nourish a prophet who stood against kings. Yet the pattern of provision here was also a pattern of isolation. Elijah lived at the margin, visible to God, almost unseen by the courts of Israel. The message was made plain by the method. Where the palace offered bread of political bargaining, the Lord provided bread that would not bind Elijah to the courts of men. When the brook was finally cut off, the Lord commanded Elijah to arise and go to Zarephath in the region of Sidon. There a widow would feed him, so the word said, and she, a woman of a foreign town, would become a vessel of God's mercy to a prophet of Israel. It was a striking reversal in a world that prized kin and tribe. The Lord's hand reaching beyond household borders, bending the arc of provision toward the outcast and the faithful in equal measure. Zarephath was a small place of white houses set on a slope toward the sea. Goats strafed the terraces, and salt smoke hovered by the shoreline. Elijah found the widow at the gate, gathering sticks for a last meal. Her eyes were hollow from fear, her vessel of oil nearly empty, her jar of flour at the point of being spent. This was the measure of near despair. She saw in Elijah only a man with the accent of the north and the look of one who brought news. "Give me water and a morsel of bread," she said in the language of the coast. Her voice held the careful economy of the starving. Elijah answered her plainly, not with courtly speech, but with the authority of one who had been sent. "Do not fear. Go, do as you said. But make me a little cake first and bring it to me. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not fail, until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth." The widow looked as one who had been told a strange kindness. She obeyed. In that small house of sun and smoke, the hands that would have ground the last grain into a humble bread were steadied by a promise spoken by a man whose faith had the ring of thunder. The flour did not finish. The oil did not fail. Each day her hearth produced enough. The rule of survival was rewritten by a covenant promise. And in that rewriting, the poor were sustained. There came a time, as often in such stories, when the fragile thread of life snapped. The widow's son fell ill. His breath left him in the middle of the night, and the silence of the room pressed against the small house like a hand. Grief is a many-voiced thing, and the widow's lament was the clearest. "What have you against me, man of God? Have you come to call my sin to mind and to slay my son?" Elijah took the child up into his own chamber and laid him on his own bed. He cried unto the Lord and stretched himself upon the child 3 times, and his petition was fierce and immediate. The widow looked as one who had been told a strange kindness. She obeyed. In that small house of sun and smoke, the hands that would have ground the last grain into a humble bread were steadied by a promise spoken by a man whose faith had the ring of thunder. The flour did not finish. The oil did not fail. Each day her hearth produced enough. The rule of survival was rewritten by a covenant promise, and in that rewriting the poor were sustained. There came a time, as often in such stories, when the fragile thread of life snapped. The widow's son fell ill. His breath left him in the middle of the night, and the silence of the room pressed against the small house like a hand. Grief is a many-voiced thing, and the widow's lament was the clearest. "What have you against me, man of God? Have you come to call my sin to mind and to slay my son?" Elijah took the child up into his own chamber and laid him on his own bed. He cried unto the Lord and stretched himself upon the child 3 times, and his petition was fierce and immediate. "O Lord my God, let this child's life return to him," he prayed, his voice breaking with a strain that belonged more to the widow than to a man accustomed to calling down droughts. He turned to the Lord as one who knew that life and death passed through God's hands. The child's breath returned. The flush of life came back into his face as if the house had been struck by a sudden wind from the sea. The widow cried out with a voice of awed confession, "Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." This scene, tender and terrible, made Elijah both the instrument of God's power and the neighbor who felt the weight of grief. It taught that miracles were not merely displays, but acts with names and faces. People restored, households kept from the brink. 3 full years passed in the silence of drought and in the quiet corners where God provided. Then the Lord's appointed time moved Elijah back into the open. He appeared before Ahab once more, and the prophet called the nation to Mount Carmel. There, on that green ridge looking out over the plain, he set the stage for a contest that the people would carry in their memory for generations: the Lord versus Baal, the living God versus idols formed by human hands. Mount Carmel was a place of sharp sky and endless sight. From its top one could see the widths of Jezreel, the distant glint where the Jordan ribboned through the land, and the low white scatter of villages. Men gathered, the common people, the courtmen, the prophets of Baal, 2 crowds facing each other like the 2 halves of a severed thing. Elijah stood and cried aloud, How long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." The words were a lance. The people answered nothing for a while. They had spoken with fear for so long that the sound of their own voices was foreign. Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal, and they set an altar to their God, calling upon him from morning until eve. They danced and cried aloud, and they even cut themselves as their God gave no answer. Their noise rose and fell like a storm that only the ear heard and not the heart. Elijah mocked them with a voice that was both sharp and sorrowful. "Cry louder, perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or on a journey, or asleep and must be awakened." Their frenzy increased, and their God gave no sign. The place smelled of smoke from their rituals, of burnt offerings that yielded no presence, and the people watched with tight mouths. When it was Elijah's turn, he repaired the ruined altar of the Lord that had been neglected, took 12 stones, one for each tribe, and arranged them in witness to the covenant. He dug a trench about the altar and laid the wood, cut the bull into pieces and placed it on the wood. Then he commanded that 4 jars of water be poured, and they poured the water upon the burnt offering and the wood. They did this twice until the trench brimmed and the stones were soaked. The act was stubborn in its simplicity. It was as if Elijah sought to deprive the scene of any excuse. The altar and the wood and the pieces lay under a sheen of water. The scent of an approaching storm mingled with the damp earth. Elijah prayed. His prayer was not a long sermon. It was a direct cry. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you turn the hearts of the people back." The words were urgent and simple. The mountain listened in the hush between the breaths of the crowd. Then fire fell from the Lord. It leapt, precise and whole, devoured the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even licked the dust until the trench drank up the flame like a thirst long satisfied. The people fell on their faces and cried out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" In that moment the pretense of Baal was stripped bare. Where there had been shouting, now there was a silence that was almost reverent. Elijah seized the hour. He bound the prophets of Baal, and the men who had led the false worship were taken down to the brook Kishon and ended there by the people's hand, judged in the wake of the Lord's clear demonstration. When the frenzy of that day had spent itself, Elijah prayed again, this time for rain. He climbed to the summit and bowed his face to the earth and cried to the Lord, "Give rain." His servant watched the horizon for a cloud. At first there was nothing. Then a small cloud like a man's hand rose from the sea. It swelled in the west, and within a short while the heavy sky broke and rain streaked down upon the parched earth. The drought ended, the land exhaled. Elijah, strengthened, ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel, for the Lord had girded him with speed like a man born on wings. Yet the triumph of Carmel did not seal peace. Jezebel's wrath burned like a persistent fever. She cursed the prophet's victory with a death sentence sent in the dark of courtly plotting. Knowing that his life was at stake, Elijah fled. He went beyond the reach of palace streets, into the expanse of the wilderness, as one who had seen the Lord's might and who now felt the frailty of his own flesh. He traveled to Beersheba of Judah, left his servant there, and walked into the wilderness, going a day's journey into it. There, beneath the broom tree, he prayed that he might die, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." He lay down and slept. An angel touched him and said, "Arise and eat."
He woke to food and water set beside him, and the angel of the Lord said to him a second time, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you."
Strength was given to him for the 40 days and 40 nights as he walked to Horeb, the mount of God, the place of revelation. At Horeb, Elijah found himself in a cave, and the Lord spoke not in the thunder, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire that shook the mountain, but in a still small voice, a whisper that attuned itself to his marrow. The prophet who had commanded the elements now listened. The Lord asked, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet answered with the truth of his heart. The zeal of the Lord had consumed him, yet he had been brought low. He stood against rulers and idolaters, and the people had forsaken the Lord. He alone remained, and his life had become a cry for death. The Lord gave him charge anew. He instructed him to anoint Hazael king over Aram, to anoint Jehu king over Israel, and to anoint Elisha son of Shaphat to succeed him as prophet. He also revealed that 7,000 in Israel had not bowed the knee to Baal, those whose knees and hearts remained steadfast though hidden. The Lord would preserve a remnant and would continue his work through successors. Elijah obeyed. He went down from the mountain and found Elisha plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, the prophet's mantle still heavy in his hands. Elijah cast his mantle upon Elisha. The call was plain, and Elisha set aside his plow, slew the oxen, and boiled their flesh for the men who would follow him. He left his father and mother and followed Elijah, asking for that portion of the Spirit that would show the double measure when he came to the time of testing. Time gathered toward the hour of departure. Elijah and Elisha walked together to the Jordan. The river ran with a steady current, and Elijah took his mantle and wrapped it and struck the water. The stream parted, and they crossed on dry ground as a reminder of the power that had worked with Moses and with the prophets who preceded them. Mourners watched. Sons of the prophets stood at a distance. They spoke little. The gravity of the moment made speech a fragile thing. As they went, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two. A whirlwind took Elijah up by the power of God into heaven. Elisha beheld it and cried out, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." He watched the mantle fall from Elijah's shoulders to the ground, and he picked it up, as if taking up the charge itself. He struck the Jordan with the mantle, and the waters parted again. He crossed over, and the sons of the prophets saw that the spirit of Elijah had come upon Elisha. The story of Elijah reaches heaven with flame and leaves on earth a succession sealed by a mantle, a parted Jordan, and a life laid down for service. It is a tale of bold confrontation and deep solitude, of fire that consumes and whisper that restores. It carries within it the truth that God can be both thunder and stillness, both judge and merciful shepherd. The people of the land remembered these things in the telling. How a prophet had called down drought and then rain, how a widow's faith had held a household, how life had been taken and returned by the hand of God, how the Lord answered in fire upon a mountain, and how a man was taken up in a whirlwind and never tasted death. They kept the names as marks on their memory: Elijah the Tishbite, Elisha his successor, Ahab and Jezebel who had shaped the tragedy and the triumph. Yet beneath the public spectacles lay the private textures of a prophet's life: hunger and provision by birds and by a widow's hand, the rawness of grief when a child dies and the desperate lifting of a face to heaven, the exhausted cry under a broom tree, the trembling of a heart that had stood before kings and yet sought shelter in a cave. These intimacies teach that service to God does not render one immune to sorrow. Rather, service holds sorrow in the presence of a God who answers with both might and mercy. In the quiet that follows loud events, the Lord provides for the continuation of His work: a remnant kept, anointed men raised, a mantle passed from shoulder to shoulder.
The prophet who went to heaven in a fiery chariot left behind a story that would knit the memory of a nation to the character of God: sovereign, patient, wrathful against falsehood, tender toward the humble. The ridge at Carmel still speaks in the remembering: the altar of stones, the trench full of water, the scent of smoke gone, and the clean air left by revelation. The brook Cherith still murmurs the memory of blackbirds and bread. The small house at Zarephath still bears the echo of a widow's oven never quite empty. And the Jordan bears the mark of two crossings, one with a prophet lifted, another with one taking up the work as if hands could pass on the very spirit of calling. There is, in these scenes, a quiet charge for those who hear the tale in later years. Faith will demand courage, and courage will bring both acclaim and solitude. Yet the Lord's ways are not always what men expect. He sends ravens as well as angels. He answers with fire and with a whisper. He raises up successors. He cares for widows. He calls the faithful to stand when the multitude falters. Now the story moves toward its fuller reckonings, confrontations yet to be resolved, journeys of doubt and restoration, and the final separation above the Jordan. But already the threads are visible: covenant and defiance, mercy and judgment, public spectacle and private lament. The people who heard these deeds were left with a single question woven into their memory: in the face of such signs, will the heart turn wholly to the Lord? And Elisha went on from thence, and came to Jericho. The men of the place came forth to meet him, and the city was dry, yet the fountain of the land was bitter.
The sons of the prophets stood by the spring and looked one to another, for their lips were parched with the memory of drought, and their hearts trembled at the shadow of new hope. Then Elisha said, "Bring me a new cruse, and put salt therein." They brought it. He went forth unto the spring, and cast the salt into the spring, and said, "Thus saith the Lord, I have healed these waters. There shall not be from them any more death or barrenness." So the waters were made wholesome unto this day, according to the word of Elisha. Word of that thing spread abroad through all the land. Men came from villages and caravans. Mothers stooped over the foundlings and tasted the water with cautious gratitude, and the fields that drank of that spring remembered coolness. It was said openly, "A prophet remaineth in Israel," and folk who had been silent a long time spoke again of covenant and wrath and mercy. Yet the mantle upon Elisha's shoulder was heavy. He walked in the places where Elijah had walked, and men looked for the same fire and the same thunder. Some sought him for counsel, some came with offerings, some came to test the man who had been set before them by a spectacle in the heavens. To each he gave himself, yet he would not be made a vessel for gain. He spoke plainly. He reproved kings when truth demanded it, and he sat with widows and with those who mourned, lifting the lowly and steadying trembling hands. There was a certain woman of great standing in the village of Shunem who perceived that he was an holy man of God. She called him and entreated him to eat of her bread whenever he tarried there. And she prepared a small chamber on the roof, with a bed and a table and a stool and a lamp, and when he passed through her place, he would rest there. In that simplicity a covenant of hospitality was made, and Elisha would not forget her kindness. In the days that followed, the woman said unto her husband, "Behold now, I perceive that this is a holy man of God, that passeth by continually. Let us make a little chamber, and let us set for him there a bed, and a table, and a stool, and a lamp. And when he passed through her place, he would rest there." In that simplicity a covenant of hospitality was made, and Elisha would not forget her kindness. In the days that followed, the woman said unto her husband, "Behold now, I perceive that this is a holy man of God, that passeth by continually. Let us make a little chamber, and let us set for him there a bed, and a table, and a stool, and a lamp. And it shall be, when he cometh to us, that he shall turn in thither.
So they did. The prophet would enter and rest, and his presence knit reverence with the ordinary tasks of life. And the Lord visited the woman, and she bare a son in due season, and the joy of the house was full. Yet joy in this world often stands close to sorrow, and it was not long before the child fell sick in the field where he played, and his soul departed. The mother laid him upon Elisha's bed, and rent her garments, and her cry pierced the house like a trumpet. She went unto the man of God, and fell at his feet, her grief without artifice, raw and demanding that God be God, even in the face of such loss. Elisha sent Gehazi his servant, and bade him take his staff and go before the woman. Gehazi went, but the child's flesh remained cold.
When Elisha came into the chamber, he closed the door upon the two, and he prayed unto the Lord. He stretched himself upon the child, and his mouth was upon the child's mouth, and his eyes upon the child's eyes, and his hands upon the child's hands, and he felt the warmth return. The Lord returned the child's life. The child sneezed 7 times, and the mother took up her son and went out, her heart a strange compound of praise and humility. So the report of the raising of the child went forth, and men marveled. Many that before had scoffed were made to wonder, and those who had sorrowed were brought again to a trembling hope. But Elisha himself did not exult. He remembered the cave, the brook, the mountain of flame, and he knew that every gift must be stewarded with trembling hands. There came also unto him a widow of a prophet's house, whose creditor sought to take her sons to be bondmen. She cried unto Elisha, Thy servant my husband is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord, and the creditor seeketh to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. Elisha said unto her, What shall I do for thee? Tell me, what hast thou in the house? She answered, Thine handmaid hath not anything in the house, save a pot of oil. Elisha said, Go, borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. And when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons, and pour out into all those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. She went from him and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, and poured out. The oil flowed, and each vessel was filled, and when they could pour no more, she set them aside. She came and told the man of God. He said, Go, sell the oil and pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children upon the rest. The hand of God provided by what seemed a small thing. The shame of bondage was turned into bread for the household. These works became the seal upon Elisha's persuasion among the people, that the Lord had not left his counsel in Israel, but continued to send forth a prophet to stand in the breach. Yet where light rises, shadow gathers. In neighboring courts, men who trafficked in power and in lies watched with unease, and those who profited by the old ways feared the renewal of a demand for justice. From time to time, envoys came from the palace with words soft as honey and harsh at the core. The land was rent by many lords, kings who sought the favor of strangers, commanders who traded in captive spoil, foreign princes who harried the borders. In the north, the kings of Syria set their faces against Israel and would have neither profit nor peace. The hearts of the people were tossed like seaweed in a storm. It came to pass also that a great company of the sons of the prophets dwelt near Elisha, and they sought instruction and sight. They besought him for counsel, and he stretched forth his hands in teaching, in prayer, and in rebuke. He wept when they hardened their hearts, and he rejoiced when they bent their knees. He sent Gehazi on errands, and Gehazi learned both the tender mercy and the dangerous confidences of a prophet's work. Once, when they went to the place of prophecy for counsel, there sat men with questions of war and of harvest, of law and of mercy. Elisha would answer by the oracle of the Lord. Sometimes the answer came clear as a blade, sometimes as a still small voice that would be known only by the one who would bow and obey. Many were healed by truth, and some were cut to the quick.
There was a season when the king of Syria gathered his captains and devised a raid. The captains said, "Let us set watch by the way of the nurseries of the king of Israel, and let us take them unawares." The king agreed, and his hosts were arrayed. The thing was whispered in the night like a serpent, but the Lord revealed to the king of Israel the counsel of the enemy by the hearing of a prophet. Thus the host of Syria was smitten again and again, for the Lord opened the king's ear to the prophet's voice, and Israel walked in the counsel given. The captains of Syria, hearing that their plans were known, set spies and sent bands to take Elisha. Night after night they lay in ambush and filled the valleys with men. When the hosts came in such strength against the city where Elisha tarried, his servant feared and said, "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" Elisha answered, "Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them." He prayed that the Lord would open the young man's eyes, and the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw the mountain full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. When the Syrians descended in the morning like a cloud, Elisha prayed that the Lord would strike them with blindness. The hand of the Lord was upon them, and their eyes were darkened. Elisha led them into Samaria, and when their captors realized their error, the king of Israel stood over them and asked what should be done. Elisha said, "Feed them and let them go to their master." So they made great bread and meat of the old victuals, and sent them away. Thus the bands returned to their Lord in peace, and fear fell upon the nations that sought to bind Israel. Through these deeds the prophet's fame was spread, and the proud were abashed. Yet every deliverance bore witness not only to the prophet, but to the God of the prophet. Elisha bore the honor low. He turned every eye from himself to the Lord, and he taught that miracles were tokens to stir repentance and faith, not ornaments to sway kings. Among all these things, Elisha wrestled beneath the weight of his calling. He remembered the voice in the wilderness that had called him, and the mantle that had lain warm upon his shoulder, and he would sometimes wake at night with the taste of dust in his mouth, and the echo of challenge in his ears. He spake the word of the Lord, and the child sneezed 7 times, and opened his eyes. The woman's heart broke, and mended at once. She fell at Elisha's feet, and bowed down, and he said, "Set things in order, for the Lord hath made this sign, that life may answer to faith." The neighbors came and marveled, and there were those who said that such power could only come from the everlasting. Yet even in joy the prophet kept his face turned away from any worship of men, and pointed every heart back to the Lord, who gives breath and takes it again. Word of this went abroad, as wind carries the smell of bread from oven to oven. Men saw that God's hand was active. Some took shame and turned to humility. Others stood and hardened. Among the latter walked a captain of Syria named Naaman, chief of the host. He was a brave man, yet he was a leper. From a captive maid who served his wife, he heard of a prophet in Israel who could cleanse. She said to her mistress, "Would that my lord were with the man of God in Samaria. He would recover him of his leprosy." And so Naaman, with horses and chariots and a letter from his lord the king to the king of Israel, came seeking what only God could give. When the king of Israel read the letter, his heart was torn, and he cried, "Am I God to kill and to make alive? Behold, my hands are full of blood." He rent his garments before his servants. But Elisha, who knew what stirring of nations is the Lord's work, sent to the king, saying, "Let him come now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." Naaman came with his company, and stood without the door. And Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, "Go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again, and thou shalt be clean." At this word Naaman's countenance fell. In his pride he had waited for a display, for sacrifice, for the prophet to call upon the name of his God, and to invoke thunder upon his house. He turned away, saying, "Aren't not the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" Yet his servants, who had come with him and beheld the shameful turning of their lord, spake, If the prophet had bid thee do some great thing, wouldst thou not have done it? How much rather when he saith, Wash and be clean? Moved by their counsel, Naaman humbled himself. He went down to the Jordan and dipped himself 7 times, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. He returned to the house of Elisha, with a heart full and hands heavy with gifts. But Elisha refused to take so much as a hair of his head. The prophet would not let a miracle be a market of gain, nor a sign be turned into a token of barter. Yet Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, saw and covetously took the counsel to follow. When Naaman was gone, Gehazi ran after him to the way and laid claim to a part of that bounty, in the name of the man of God.
He demanded and lied and put his hand upon that which was not his to take. Elisha, who moves with the patience of the plowman and the strictness of the sower, met him. "Whence comest thou, Gehazi?" said he. Gehazi, who had contrived a tale, answered with a shadow. Then Elisha said, "Did not my heart go with thee that I went not? Is it a time to take silver and garments, and to take 2 talents of silver and 2 changes of garments, and to receive the silver and the garments in the name of Naaman?" And the word of the prophet clove to the man's conscience like a sword. He said, "Forasmuch as Naaman came in peace to meet thee, and he stood and called on the God of Israel before him being a mighty man, and turned away from idols, therefore it was strange to thee to take reward." Gehazi's countenance fell, and the hand of the Lord was upon him. The leprosy of Naaman cleaved to him and became his portion forever. He went forth a leper, as white as snow, and the house of the prophet was chastened in silence. So the signs wrought by Elisha were as a mirror. They reflected God's mercy and exactness, and they tried the hearts of those who dwelt near the prophet. The kings grew in fear and in wonder. The common folk kept watch at the gate to see if the Lord would yet do more. In the markets, men told how bread was multiplied and how pots of pottage were made wholesome. In the courts, men spoke of houses where the dead were restored. Each miracle was a summons. Repent and know that the God of Israel ruleth. And yet with each marvel came a choice. Some bowed. Some measured the wonder and put it in their coffers. Some made of it an idol of their own favor. In the courts of the kings there were counsels both wise and wicked. The king of Israel sought to hold to the old ways of covenant, to do justice, and to repel the hand of the proud. His neighbor, the king of Syria, raged by fits and sent out raiding bands, thinking to take advantage of any failing. Men hardened in power, yet trembled at the fame of the prophet. Princes whispered in one another's ears, and the Lord's purposes moved like unseen rivers beneath. Elisha walked among these things as one who knows both the bolt and the plowshare. He strove to bind mercy with teaching and to let judgment follow only after long warning. Now there came a time when famine of spirit and hunger of heart lay upon the land. A great scarcity of grain was felt in Samaria, and the king sat at the gate in anguish. The people murmured, and false comforts were proffered by men who would make gain of distress. Yet at the same time men came flocking to the prophet for counsel. Elisha stood before the king and said, "Thus saith the Lord, set this house in order. Provide food where none is thought to be. For the Lord will send food into this city, and they shall see in that day that there is a God in Israel." He named a remedy both simple and strange. Bring forth what little there was, and let the mouths that hunger be fed. The Lord would multiply, as he had done in the days of Elijah and beyond. The king doubted out of the weight upon his shoulders, but the prophet persisted,
And in the end the people found that the bread of life comes not by cunning of men only, but by the motion of the Almighty. Men carried out what they could, and the Lord made it to be enough. In that hour many were turned. Some returned to their fathers' God, who had been absent by neglect and custom. Others hardened their hearts, preferring the ease of wells that runneth dry to the deep droughts of contrition. Thus the land was taught again, by life returned, by flesh cleansed, by pot of pottage made wholesome. But the prophet knew that outward relief is not the end. He pressed upon every man that the mercy shown should lead to truth, that hearts be cleansed as well as bodies, that the yoke of injustice be broken, that the widening of the table be matched by the widening of the heart. For a nation may be fed, and yet be barren of righteousness. It may be cleansed, and yet not learn humility. And so the days moved toward a season when kingdoms would be tried more deeply. Reports came of chariots arrayed, and kings leaning on alliances that would cost them their souls. The prophet watched, and he prayed, and he instructed the rulers in simple words that crushed conceit. Fear the Lord and turn from trifles that call themselves gods. He taught that power without justice is a specter that will devour its makers, and that a people's strength is measured in how it shelters the weak. In the hush that followed these teachings there was a stir of preparation. Elisha girded himself to speak again to those who would listen, and to confront those who would not. He would not seek the throne nor the gold. His contest was to set before the people a choice that must be made, and soon. To cleave to the Lord, or to cleave to the hollow things that bear no fruit in the day of harvest. The prophet's voice grew clearer in the ears of the trembling, and the kings, some fearful, some defiantly proud, waited to see whether their people would stand with them or with the covenant. Thus the work went on, and Elisha, whose mantle had lain warm upon his shoulder, walked among men with the patience of one who knows that the storm is long and that the vine must be pruned before it yields wine. He spoke to rulers, he taught the widow and the stranger, he reproved greed where it showed its face, and he kept the flame of the true worship alive amid the ashes of custom. The hour of decision drew near. The nation felt it in its bones, and all who had ears to hear prepared themselves, each in his own way, for the test that would come. And it came to pass that the tidings of war waxed louder in the land. Raiders came by night from the side of Syria, and the reports of their host were as a shadow upon the plain.
The servants of the king were filled with fear, and the counselors sought counsel of the prophets and of the elders. Yet the thoughts of the king were vexed, for his heart was cast between faith and the craft of men. Now Elisha was in a city not far from Dothan, and his eyes were clear to see what was hid. In the night a band of chariots and men encompassed the city and set themselves in wait. The servants ran to Elisha in alarm, and one said, "Alas, my lord, the host of the Syrians hath compassed the city round about. What shall we do?" And the man of God looked upon the servant and answered him, "Fear not, for they that are with us are more than they that be with them." But the servant looked out at the camp and spake, "Behold, my lord, we see naught but the men of Syria, and our eyes are dim for fear." Then Elisha prayed, and he said, "Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes, that he may see." And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he looked, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. The sight was like a host not of flesh, but of the Lord's own guard. And the servant was stricken with astonishment, and fell upon his face. When the morning came, the king of Syria sent out a great battalion to take Elisha. They compassed the city where the prophet abode, and made their watch about Dothan. But the Lord turned their counsel to folly. The men of war were smitten as to sight. Elisha, seeing them without their eyes, rose up and went forth unto them, and said unto them, This is not the way, nor the city which ye seek. I will lead you to the man ye seek. Follow me. And they followed him, their feet guided, though their eyes were blind. So Elisha brought them into Samaria, into the presence of the king of Israel. When they came in, the king was wroth, and commanded his officers, saying, Shall I smite them? Shall I smite them? But the prophet stayed the hand of the king, and said, Lay thine hand upon these men. Bring them before me. Let bread and water be set before them, that they may eat and drink, and return to their master. For Elisha would not have the mercy of God turned to vengeance, nor would he see men perish that the Lord had delivered into his hands, as if he were a thing to be used. The officers obeyed, and they set victuals before the blinded host. And when their eyes were opened, and they saw their bread and their drink, they were filled with wonder and fear. Then the men of the host remembered that they were captains under a king, and their Saul-like hearts were humbled. They rose and took their way to their lord, and when they reported what had befallen them, the king of Syria waxed sore afraid. He saw thereafter that the God of Israel was mighty to save and to scourge, and many of his designs were turned away by fear. Thus it came to pass that some hearts were moved to cease from the rage that had been upon them, and in other places men's devices grew subtler, as men seek a path when the strong hand of God hath been shown. Elisha, seeing this, redoubled his teaching. He charged princes to remember mercy, and he reproved commanders who took spoil with a proud hand. He would have none of counsel that sought only to aggrandize, and he held before them the law that forbearance is greater than swift conquest, and that the blessing of the Lord abideth where justice is kept. Yet the land was not wholly quiet, for while one host had been turned aside, other threats rose at the borders. Alliances forged in haste made men secure who should have feared. The people waxed weary of war and lean for bread. The memory of famine yet lay upon many a household. In those days men were apt to forget the mercy that had rescued them when their bellies were full, and to ascribe their deliverance to their own cunning when the winds blew favorably. Therefore Elisha labored all the more to set the fear of the Lord in the midst of the city, and to make plain that no human counsel could stand where the Lord hath spoken. And it came to pass in a season after these things, that the king of Israel, being sore beleaguered by a new terror, sent messengers unto Elisha. The messengers found the prophet sitting by the gate of the city, and they said, Our lord the king hath need of thy word. The Syrians have taken counsel again. There be men with counsel to besiege the plain, and to come by stealth. The king is filled with dread. Elisha rose and girt his loins, and he answered them, saying, Fear not those that think themselves mighty. The Lord will make their counsel as a spider's web. He went with them unto the palace, and before the king he stood, and declared plainly the things that God revealed to him. Hear, hearken unto me, said he. The Lord setteth a snare for the proud. He shall bring down the chariot, and spoil the pride of the strong. Make now thy house ready, and set thy heart to seek the poor and the widow, for in this shall thy kingdom stand. The king, hearing, was at first slow to bow. Yet the prophet's words fell upon many a heart like rain upon parched ground, and some among the rulers were pricked, and began to make provision for the needy. There were some, however, who scoffed, and said, What profit is there in feeding the poor? We must heap up store that we may brave the next day. To these Elisha spoke with a voice that trembled not. He that shutteth his hand from the poor shall find his hand empty in the day of trouble. But he that inclineth his heart to justice shall have his table full in days of famine, and his sons shall remember him for good. His words were as a hammer upon stubborn stone. Some yielded, and some hardened still. Meanwhile the Lord continued his work in ways that men could not foresee.